Imagine stepping back in time to a world where the streets are mud and the skies are dark, where the air is thick with the stench of rot and the cries of the dying. This is the world of the Dark Ages, a time when life was brutal, short, and full of suffering. Imagine a place where the forests are not just dense and green, but are homes to monsters both real and imagined, where people live in constant fear of disease, famine, and violence. This is the world that existed for many in Europe between the fall of the Roman Empire and the dawn of the Renaissance, a period that lasted roughly from the 5th to the 15th century. In this essay, we will explore the harsh realities of life during the Dark Ages, from the plagues that decimated populations to the technological stagnation that left people struggling with basic survival. The Dark Ages began as the Roman Empire crumbled. For centuries, the Romans had built a vast network of roads, aqueducts, and cities that connected Europe and beyond. When the empire fell, much of this infrastructure was neglected or destroyed. The once proud roads that had linked cities across continents were left to crumble, and the sophisticated drainage systems that kept cities clean and healthy were forgotten. This meant that towns and villages were often flooded, and diseases spread rapidly in the stagnant, contaminated water. One of the most devastating events of the Dark Ages was the Black Death, a plague that first appeared in Europe in the 14th century. This disease was so deadly that it killed about 1/3 of the population of Europe. Imagine living in a time when every third person you knew suddenly fell ill and died within days. The Black Death was just one of many pandemics that swept through Europe during this period, each time thinning the population and leaving survivors weakened and vulnerable. But disease was not the only threat. The climate during the Dark Ages was also unpredictable and harsh. Storms and floods were common, and without the infrastructure to manage them, these natural disasters often turned into catastrophic events. Crops were destroyed, homes were washed away, and people were left to fend for themselves in a world that seemed determined to extinguish life. Life was also incredibly difficult for the average person. Most people were farmers, living in small, isolated communities. They used primitive tools like picks, forks, spades, and scythes to till the land and harvest crops. Iron was scarce, so there were few plows, and the ones that existed were basic and inefficient. This made farming a backbreaking task, especially in the north, where the soil was heavy and difficult to work. Horses and oxen were available, but without the horse collar, harness, and stirrup, they were of limited use. This meant that much of the work had to be done by hand, and people often worked themselves to exhaustion. The lack of technology extended beyond farming. In all of Germany, England, Holland, and Scandinavia, virtually no stone buildings, except for cathedrals, were constructed for 10 centuries. The art of bricklaying had been lost, and the few buildings that did exist were often crude and poorly constructed. Even the roads, which were once the pride of the Roman Empire, were in such a state of disrepair that they were almost unusable. Commerce was slow to recover, and it wasn't until the 8th century that trade began to pick up again. The forests that covered much of Europe were vast and menacing. The Hercynian forest, in particular, was a place of fear and danger. It was home to wild animals like boars, bears, and wolves, which often attacked travelers. But the forest was also home to outlaws and bandits, who preyed on the weak and defenseless. These criminals were rarely caught, and the law was often powerless to stop them. This meant that people lived in constant fear of being robbed, kidnapped, or killed. The violence of the Dark Ages was pervasive. Homicides were twice as common as accidental deaths, and only a small fraction of murderers were ever brought to justice. In England, coroners' records show that only 1 in 100 murderers was ever punished. Abduction for ransom was a common practice, and skilled but landless knights often turned to this as a means of survival. The violence extended to everyday life, with deaths in alehouse brawls, wrestling matches, and even football games being shockingly frequent. Tournaments, which are often romanticized in literature, were actually violent and deadly affairs. These were not the chivalrous contests of knights in shining armor, but brutal battles where large groups of armed men fought each other for sport. In one tournament near Dusseldorf in 1240, 60 knights were killed. Despite the violence, the people of the Dark Ages were deeply religious. The Church had replaced the Roman Empire as the dominant force in Europe, and converting pagans to Christianity was a major focus. However, this conversion was often achieved through violence and coercion. For example, Charlemagne, the king of the Franks, gave Saxon rebels a choice between baptism and execution. When they refused, he had 4,500 of them beheaded in a single day. The church's influence was so strong that even the smallest offenses could be punished by death. The threat of capital punishment was used to enforce religious doctrines, and medieval threats were not idle. Those who dared to question the church's teachings were often executed as heretics. One of the most famous examples of this is the Arian controversy, where Christians who believed that Jesus was not divine were persecuted and killed. The Dark Ages were a time of paradoxes. People were both bloodthirsty and devout, violent and religious. They lived in a world where death was a constant presence, and yet they clung to their faith with a fierce determination. The church, which should have been a source of comfort and guidance, often became a tool of oppression and violence. Despite the darkness of this period, it was also a time of resilience and survival. People found ways to live and thrive in a world that was often hostile and unforgiving. In conclusion, the Dark Ages were a time of great hardship and suffering. The lack of technology, the prevalence of disease, and the constant threat of violence made life difficult and often short. However, it was also a time of deep faith and community, where people banded together to survive in a world that was often dark and terrifying. Understanding the Dark Ages helps us appreciate the progress we have made, and the challenges we still face in creating a world that is more just and humane.